Guys, let's talk about leadership. Leadership is it's a big round topic that's out there, and I think in some ways it's something that we feel that we understand, but in a lot of cases I don't know that we do understand it. And I think it's just kind of funny that way. Everybody thinks of themselves as a leader, but I don't know that we often, actually spend time trying to develop ourselves into a leader, whether it's in our family, the church, secular work. So let's open this up. How do we define leadership? Let's just start there. What do we define leadership as? If we were to, if somebody was sitting here saying, hey, here's what a leader is, how do we define that?
Well, I always start with Mark 10:45, and I may be going ahead into more of the servant spiritual leadership, but to me, when people ask me about leadership or even just being successful in life, I think of Mark 10:45, and to me that's where it starts. And there's a couple observations there. So Jesus says, I have not come here, the Son of Man has not come here to be served, but to serve. So if God in the flesh, Son of God, it has that type of mindset. I'm not here to be waited on, to serve, but to serve. What does that tell me? As a person, as a leader, to me that's where it has to start, is that humility. And so that's the first thing I think of when I think of leadership, is looking at Jesus. But also from that, I always understand who you serve. Okay, I think that's critical in understanding who you serve. And and I think a lot of, especially I'll say Christian leadership, but to me it goes over in the business world. I mean, in the business world, you have to understand who you serve. You serve your board of directors, you serve a company I work for is privately held, a family. You have to understand who you serve. But I think Jesus was very clear on understanding who he served. When we think of John 17, that beautiful prayer, I mean, it's very clear why he was there in that mission. And I think he understood the servant heart, the servant attitude, but also who he served. And I think as a leader, that's where I have to start. The greatest among you will be a servant, Matthew 23:11. So that's where it has to start. I think that humility, as far as being a leader, not putting yourself above somebody else, understanding who you serve as a Christian leader. Of course, we're going to look to God. We're serving God and his son, Jesus Christ, as we think about this leadership, the leadership qualities that we ought to have.
I was like my grandpa always says, we don't need cowboys, we need shepherds.
Yeah.
Cowboys drive, shepherds lead.
Yeah.
I thought that was always a cool idea.
I'll just jump in with you a little, Mark. I think, because I actually thought of the first question as a step before that, but I like you leading with it. Look at there, I'm already leadership. But in the corporate world, or maybe not only in the corporate world, but leadership outside of the kingdom, leadership is about authority and responsibility. And there's a lot of ways you can define it, and for me, 20-something, 30-something years ago, when I got into the kind of corporate environment, things were very different then. The corporate structures were more like the military, and it was very, here's the order of authority, and here's how you follow that, and here's how that's going to play out for you in your career, and then here's how you behave in that environment. That's literally how it felt coming out of college in my first experience. Over time, actually, the corporate world related to leadership has changed substantially in the last 30 years, substantially. Today, if you speak to a leader, CEO or business leader, anyone who's has this authority, responsibility in the corporate world, they're typically going to be talking about engagement or influence. The language there has really changed, and I think moved more towards this than many realize. Most still think, oh, it's still like the military. But then if you play that through to what you said, I would say that nuance is, in the corporate world, it is about authority and responsibility. But when the authority is his, then it's about responsibility. And so when you think of being a servant, there's a responsibility. Everything you do is based on responsibility versus authority. And I think that's that real line that sits between the two sides of it.
You know, on the kind of the basic level, I think leadership is motivating or moving others in the direction of my will. And so that can take on different nuances, but to your point, if my will is to do God's will in the church as a leader, then as a leader, I'm seeking to motivate or move people in the direction of God's will. And so I think, you know, to your point, there has been some shift in what leadership language says. And so it's more in a sense of influencing people toward what God would have them do, as opposed to maybe if I'm more inwardly focused or selfish in my attitude, not humble, like Christ, then moving people or motivating people in the direction of my will becomes what I want them to do, as opposed to maybe what God wants them to do.
Someone said persuasion is the fine art of letting other people have my way. That may not be good. That may not be good. I've read a lot of, Charles Hodge has a series, the preacher, the elder, deacon's teacher. He said, you give a man any title you want. If nobody's following him, he's not a leader. So look back. Is anybody following you? Leadership, somebody's following you. And just because you have a title doesn't mean you're leading. I also thought leaders are good followers first. The idea of follow me as I follow Christ is the verse I looked up because obviously in our setting, a spiritual setting, I think the best spiritual leaders are the ones who are doing the best job of following in the footsteps of Jesus. It is not just a title that someone has or a position they have. The folks who are really living close to the heart of God and following in the footsteps of Jesus, they're leading by example. They're living it. And so I can't separate leadership from lifestyle or, you know, by example.
When I first started teaching leadership, I did some research to where I went back and I looked at the history of our country from 1920 to the present. And I looked at who the president was that served the longest during that period of time. And I looked at how leadership was defined during that time. And so over the last 100 plus years, what I found fascinating is that the definition changed almost every decade. And as Brady was talking about, you know, in the last 20, 30 years, it's really moved towards the idea of more being influence. John Maxwell's coined the phrase, leadership is influence, no more, no less. But the thing that was interesting to me is that generally the definition of leadership was defined based upon the circumstances that were either taking place in this country or on a world stage. And so whether it was, you know, when we were dealing with Hitler and all of that took place during that time, you know, leadership was defined in connection to the idea of not being coercive. And because of what was being seen with Hitler and the way that he was ruling that part of the country or the world at that time. And so it was like, okay, we know what leadership is not. Yeah. And so what is leadership? And so they would try to define it in those terms. And then to kind of tie in the idea of what you're talking about, Mark, and the idea of being a servant. My favorite definition, and I think about the book of Esther, you read through the book of Esther, you kind of get the epitome of both good and bad leadership. But my favorite thing that was said is in the very last verse of Esther in chapter 10, verse 3, because once Mordecai came to a position of leadership, what it is said of him is that he worked for the good of the people and he spoke up for their welfare. And to me, that's probably for me, that's my go-to definition. When I think about leadership, you see a leader, it's somebody who's working for the good of others and they speak up for their welfare. And I always tell congregations when I'm working with them, if you're looking out among the congregation, you look for people like that, that's going to be a good leader.
Yeah. Yeah. If we, you know, transitioning from how we define it to how God defines it, I like what you were talking about, the the example. I love that, the idea of imitation that Paul brings out in 1 Thessalonians. You know, it started out, if you think about how the whole progression happened, Jesus came, he taught the disciples. Well, the disciples were to go into the world, and they were to make more disciples. And so when Thessalonica was started, you know, of course, the apostles taught them, and it tells us in chapter 1 that they became imitators of us and of the Lord. And so there's something about the apostles that showed Jesus, and that had a great effect. So there's a pattern that goes forward, but there's a pattern that goes backward, as you're always looking to continue to make disciples, but they're always looking back to Jesus because they can see it in the one before them. So I think that's really the idea of a disciple is that a rabbi trains a disciple to become like the teacher. And as an effect, we read in chapter 1 that they became an example, chapter 1 and verse 7, to all the believers in Macedonia and Achaia. I mean, the gospel spread like wildfire because these people were on fire for the Lord. And I think that also plays into what we read in Philippians chapter 2, as it's talking about having the mind of Christ, have this attitude, or have the attitude of Christ or the mind of Christ, and display that, be like him. And there's a great essence of humility that Jesus brought. He should have been the guy that says, you do this, you do this, you do this, but he didn't do that. He served, and that was his leadership style.
Say that line again from Scripture, that will looking out for the good of the people.
Oh yeah, in Esther 10 verse 3 it says he worked for the good of the people and he spoke up for their welfare.
I just, having been here at North MacArthur for over 20 years, that is such a great, that's directly from Scripture, but what a great quality and character to see in your elders. Since one's sitting here, I want to make sure I slide that in there, but they care about the people.
I'm making one note about
They care about the, you mentioned cowboy shepherd, shepherds care. They know the sheep, they care about the sheep. Great leadership is not just obsessed with my position, my role, my own well-being, how people view me, my reputation, my stature, kind of in the group. They care about the people. And that just struck me. What a great thought from Scripture of, and then you see it in real life. You go, that's what real leadership looks like. They care about the people that follow them.
You can't fake that, because you'll be exposed if you do fake that. If you're just in it for yourself or for office or authority or power or whatever. Look what I've done. I mean, an elder, and I was asked once and decided I wasn't ready. But whenever an elder's asked or someone is asked, to me, you should be looking over your shoulder, going, "You talking to me?" Because you shouldn't. You should not. If you're trying to attain something for your own personal gain, and even in the business world, I think if you do that, you're not going to have people want to follow you. You have to be amongst the people. You have to be willing to be with the people. You have to be willing to care about them, know about them. Just like the example in the Good Shepherd in John 10. I mean, Jesus is the shepherd he knows his flock. He knows each one of them very well. So he knows how to be able to comfort, to care, to lead, to feed, all those things. I know here at North MacArthur, one of the things we do to make sure we're very visible during Sunday services, we have a big auditorium. We have a lot of people in here. We'll have 650 on a Sunday morning, but we all kind of sit in different areas of the congregation, of the auditorium. But during the closing song, the elders head to the doors back of the auditorium to meet and greet people, because sometimes there may not be a response down front, but there may be a response in the back. I remember my wife's grandfather was an elder at a church in Ohio, and I learned he always sat in the back because he was like, I need to be in the back so people can see me, so I can see people, see everybody in front of me, be able to look for people that may be hurting, may have some joy in their life. But I think we want to, at North MacArthur, we want to be visible to the people because we want to be there for them if they need something, and to be out there amongst the flock.
I know you don't want to limit leadership to eldership, but there's an old line: if a guy runs for the office, make sure he doesn't get elected. Some people want it for the wrong reasons. And those that have to almost be coaxed into it and encouraged, that have a sense of humility, that really are, am I up for that task? It is a high calling to be a leader in the kingdom, to be somebody that others look to as the example to follow. And so I love that line that you shared from Scripture, because sometimes we get so into our own ego or position. It's not about us.
Yeah.
It's not about the leader. It's about the people that they're trying to serve. And man, that was great.
Well, we've talked a lot about being servants, and I'm all on board with that. Obviously, it's biblical. But I was thinking about a podcast I listened to one time, Patrick Lencioni, who is leader of the Table Group, and he made this statement that just caught me so off guard, because he said, there is no such thing as servant leadership. He said, if you're a leader, you're a servant. You either serve yourself or you serve others. And I've never forgotten that. I just thought, that is so true, because if you're a leader, you are a servant. It's not like you can describe leadership as being a servanthood, but if you're a leader, you're a servant. You either serve yourself or you serve others.
And that ties into the Esther quote that you gave, as well as Lencioni, when you think about what Ezekiel has to say in Ezekiel 34, verse 16, and you can see where the shepherd is the one who goes out and seeks those that are lost, who brings back those that are strayed, binds up the injured, and is the one who helps or strengthens the weak. And that in and of itself, that leadership task is one that is servanthood itself.
Yeah.
One thing to mention, I kind of bridge to where we are. You mentioned earlier, Tim, that you could define leadership by saying, and I know we're on the next step, but by saying you can't be a leader if you don't have followers. I totally agree. And something that I saw and have witnessed many times kind of in all walks of my life is that leaders are elected, they're not appointed. You in the corporate world, I could put somebody and say, hey, you're the president over this business. And just because I appointed them doesn't mean the people will follow them.
Yeah.
At some point, the people have to elect them, choose them as their leader, or they're really not their leader. They may have the authority that they've been given in the corporate environment. Well, a good friend of mine wrote the best-selling leadership book of all times a few years ago. The guy's name's Barry Conchie. He's a great guy, brilliant guy. And he kind of turned a leadership book on its head. Because usually if you would read a leadership book in the corporate world, it was written by someone like Jack Welch, and the name of the book is Jack. And so Jack Welch then was telling you why he was a great leader. Mm-hmm. And most leadership books were written that way. Well, Barry thought, well, why don't we let followers tell us what a great leader looks like? So they actually interviewed a little more than 10,000 people. And they came down to four things that followers look for in a leader. He actually told me those four things at lunch before the book came out, and argued with him about one of them, but we won't get into that. And but what's interesting is, as he was describing it, you could just hear Jesus. And here's what they were. Number one was compassion. The number one thing that followers look for in any walk of life, doesn't matter what they do, is they look for a leader that they believe has honest and pure compassion. Number two is trust. They cannot follow someone that they don't trust. Number three is vision. They're looking for someone that's showing them, here's where we're going and here's where we can be together. And they want it because purpose, it's about purpose at the end of the day. And the last one is hope. A leader that they can look at and say, with them as my leader, I have hope for tomorrow. Well, that's a sermon. I mean, as soon as he said it to me at lunch, I'm like, you just preached a sermon. There it is right there. And the truth is, no matter where you look with Jesus, it's always those four things, always. And I think for us as leaders in the church, we have to understand that from a responsibility perspective and not expect us to have this pass-through authority that says we can do whatever. We have to be elected, and I know you know what I mean now when I say that, or otherwise we're not leading for him. Servant leadership is interesting because it's either you're leading as a servant or you are a servant leader for him. You understand what I mean? And it actually means both. And I think for us getting, for all of us, getting our really understanding that deeply helps us, moves us to a different place.
Well, I don't know the plan, but I'd sure like to talk about and explore those four pieces. I mean, I guess we will at different points during the conversation, but well, that thing about trust is the big one for me.
Yeah.
I often talk about the idea of being trustworthy, and to me it's my prayer, in any setting is, am I worthy of someone's trust? Am I living, we talk about being an example and being an imitator of Christ, and am I living the kind of life that someone would consider me worthy of their trust as their leader? And I've heard my whole life this idea of we need to trust God with all of our heart. I know the passage in Proverbs 3. But I wonder sometimes if we've ever turned that around and think, am I leading in a way that is worthy of God's trust in me and all He's entrusted to me? The people that are following, they've been entrusted to us as a leader. And are we worthy of what God has entrusted to us? And I tell you, that's part of my prayer every day, and that's just one of those things that just makes me shudder to think in terms of my relationship with people and as one who leads. Am I worthy of that trust? That's powerful stuff.
Bob, you pulled something out of me on that one. When God said David was a man after his own heart. Mm-hmm. That was actually a leadership statement because he had another man at the time who used God. Mm-hmm. Saul used God. He was a power that Saul could call to bear when he felt like it or wanted to. Where with David led for God. And the depth of that statement is really there, and that's exactly what you're describing.
Well, I think we're moving along really nicely because what you brought out in those four things and going with that trust, it is one thing. We have a perception of ourselves as leaders, as preachers, as elders, as businessmen, whatever. But there's another perception. And that's kind of what you were leading into. I guess really there's two other perceptions, right? There's our perception of ourselves, there's God's perception of us, and what you mentioned is the people's perception of you. Mm-hmm. Do all of those things line up? If we think about, the critical aspects of and characteristics of leadership, of what a godly leader looks like in any role, all of those things matter. If you have too high of opinion of yourself, am I going to be able to lead properly? If God doesn't have the right view of what I am I going to be good in His eyes? And if I'm not leading properly, I'm going to lose the people that I'm leading. And I think all of those have to be considered because the reality is that every Christian, right? This is a spiritual thing that we're doing here. Every Christian, and I think this has to get across, is a leader, should be a leader, and should be a servant. However those things work together, every single disciple of Christ should be leading and serving in some way. And too often we avoid it either altogether or we embrace it too much and think that we're too much. and then we end up hurting people or families, the church, whatever. And we all have to think about those perceptions. How I look at myself matters, and it's so easy to get caught up in it, like I'm too good or I'm too bad. And then from God's perspective, He's always looking at the potential that we have. If He wasn't looking at our potential, then there would be no reason to ever mess with us. And then the people, they're either looking at two perspectives too, the potential of our leadership or how bad our leadership is, which goes back to those 4 things that you mentioned. So I think it's worthy of hashing some of those out. You've already talked about trust.
Well, and to me, trust is kind of would be the pinnacle, I would think, because if I'm compassionate, if I show people that I care about them and that I'm aware of their needs, I'm working for their good because I have that compassion, and if I've cast a vision for them to help them see that it's going to be better for them in the future, and that I give them hope, those 3 things to me are kind of like those building blocks to that pinnacle of trust. Because if they know that I care about them, and I've given them something to look forward to that's better than where they are now, and they have hope of getting there, then they're going to be saying, that's somebody I can trust. That's why I jumped on the trust piece first, because I thought that to me is a pinnacle. And it will preach. I'm already thinking about how I can use those 4 in a session. So yeah,
there's another book coming out very soon.
Well, with everyone being a leader, or that thought of everybody in the church serving as a leader, or at least having the potential. I think about what Paul wrote to the Romans. It's chapter 12, about verse 4, where he starts talking about the different gifts that God has given to us, and how the goal there is for us to serve and work to the full and come together, as he writes in other places about the church being like a body, every part functioning properly. But in verse 3, just prior to his going into that particular section, he says, by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you not to think more highly of himself than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment. And so a lot of times in leadership, and especially among ministers and elders within the church, there can be a tendency to elevate ourselves above others and to think more highly of ourselves. But it's interesting to me that Paul is not writing that to leaders in the church specifically. He's writing it to the church. And so I would say, as leaders, we need to be modeling that humility and that lifestyle that says, I'm not intoxicated on myself, but I'm thinking soberly about who I am, recognizing that God has given me, and he goes on to talk about the gifts, that God has given me these gifts, and he expects me to put them into practice and use them not for my glory, but for his glory.
Yeah.
I think, how can I do that? If we're talking about, the entire body being leaders, and then you have the folks out there are going, well, I don't know, I'm not a leader. How do I do that? I think it was Aubrey Johnson, a great preacher, writer, The Brotherhood, love the guy, this most practical author and preacher I know. Sorry, Tim. No. Shot number 1.
Again, there's an X going on here. X marks the spot right there.
Tim knows how much I love him.
The first shot has been fired.
The only 2 friendlies are me and Bob.
What's not to love about Aubrey Johnson? Come on, man.
Aubrey said how do you put it? The home or the family is the research and development lab for leadership, if you think about it.
It's true.
And I think if we're trying to project everybody's a leader, start at the home. Start where you start. Was it Nick Saban? He had a phrase, just be where your feet are.
Yeah.
Okay? Don't get thinking about too much of the past. Don't get distracted with maybe potential in the future or where you want to be. Where are you right now? Focus on the task at hand. Focus on where your feet are right now and get to work. And I think that's one of the things that, from a leadership standpoint and trying to broadcast that out to everybody in the congregation is maybe start at the home. And it doesn't mean you have to have a family. Maybe that's, you're single, but maybe you don't have kids, but start where your feet are. And a lot of times that's at the home. And that's where I think all of us at this table, maybe you really think about the genesis of maybe our leadership and getting our footing and really seeing where God wants us to be. It really began at the home, and usually with some trials and things that we've all encountered.
Mm-hmm. Bob, I think because of what you said earlier, and just as we discuss the idea of leaders love their people, I was talking about wisdom in a lesson on Sunday, and the idea of counselors. Yeah. And even great leaders, I think, need to take counsel and have people that they can go and share ideas with. And when Rehoboam goes to the older men, and this line, if you'll be a servant to these people, if you'll serve them and give them a favorable answer, they will always be your servants. And whether it's compassion or humility or trust, when people look at spiritual leaders as people that are serving them and loving them, how is that hard to follow? And not to be negative, but I think poor leadership, this idea of authoritarian, if that's the correct term, the younger men say, hey, tell them, you think my dad was hard on you. Wait till you see what I do. He lost the people.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of leaders do that. They think, well, I'm in the position, I have the title, I'm running things right. Yeah, you're running things right into the ground. Because if people don't believe that you love and care for them, I don't care what title you have.
That's right.
Or how much you appeal to your biblical authority. You've lost the people.
Yeah.
And this idea of if you serve them and you love them, they're going to be your servants. They're going to follow you. And that idea of trust, I think, is so vital. Mm-hmm. I'm coming up on 21 years here, and I think one thing that I've learned by watching a very healthy eldership function, they have the trust of the people that worship here. Yeah. People trust them, and difficult decisions have to be made. We're living in times that can be very turbulent, whether it's political, social, some of the things that happened, a health crisis in 2020. I think this membership had total trust in what the elders decided to do. And boy, that was hard enough to try to navigate through all of those challenges. Can you imagine doing that and not having the trust of the people?
I was thinking about while you were talking, heard a preacher say one time he got done preaching a lesson and got in his car, and his wife was in there. He said, you know what, I don't know if there's too many preachers that could have preached a lesson like that today. She said, probably one less than you think. Yeah. I thought that was really good.
Yeah. The wives can do that too.
Wives can do that, yeah. But again, that perception of yourself, I'm the only one that's right here. If you think you're the only one that's right, you're probably the only one that's wrong. Yeah. And I think there's a lot to be said. But you talked about doing hard things in hard times. You think about when Israel came back from captivity in Ezra chapter 7 and verse 10, and he said, he set his heart to study the law of the Lord and to teach it. Well, they hadn't been taught it for 70 years. And I think the only person, at least that we know of, there's faithful people during that time, but the only person during that time that we're really looking at, even searching the scripture, at least that we have example of, is Daniel. And Daniel 9:2, as he was searching what Jeremiah had written about the years of captivity. So you think about when they go back, Zerubbabel begins to rebuild the temple. There's a presence there, but now Ezra finds all this stuff, and he's like, okay, there's something different here. We got to make some changes. And if you keep on reading, there's some big changes that were made. And so just like the eldership here during a really hard time, sometimes leaders have to do the hard things that you probably don't like. But if you do it in a compassionate way and they trust in your thoughts and in your ideas and in your judgments and decisions, it makes it so much easier. Otherwise, like has already been said, we're not going to do what you just said. That doesn't make any sense. We don't even believe you. And so you've lost them before you ever had them.
Yeah, off of that example, which I thought was great. if you really, if you look here or you look around at leaders, you end up seeing like 3 categories. If you think of a fourth one, let me know, but I only know of 3. If you were to kind of grade them, how, one could be successful, meaning a successful leader. They had this to be done, and they achieved the desired result. Success, check. Another would be unsuccessful, failed, just didn't get it done. Did not get the desired result, did not get there. But for his leaders, whether it be that example or any other example you see, there's this other category, and that's effective leaders. And the difference is, if you look at the definition of an effective leader, there's someone who produced a desired effect. Instead of someone who achieved a desired result, there's someone who produced a desired effect. And if you think about that, it takes the leader in many ways completely out of it. And it's that real pass-through. God, through a leader that's his servant, to help produce a desired effect on the other side, which means, and whether it's Matthew 28, 19 and 20, go make disciples and teach, or almost any other example. Throughout Scripture, it's always them leading for him, and therefore there's this effect to go on that has an impact on his people and changes them. It becomes completely not about the leader. They're just a mediator or an instrument for him.
Well, if we look at how those first 2, successful and unsuccessful, by how our world defines it, the Bible is full of unsuccessful men.
Yeah.
I mean, Jeremiah would be the worst preacher in the world.
Yeah.
No converts. Moses, horrible leader. You're supposed to take him in the promised land, you did not. I mean, Jesus, you came, in their minds, right? You're going to take over, and you're gonna do away with Rome, and you're gonna establish your kingdom. That was their thoughts. Take over the Davidic, the throne of David, but you died. I mean, if you're really looking at it from a pure, how we define it from a worldly perspective, this book is full of failures. But I love what you said. It's about the effective change. Romans 12:2, the transformation, the renewal of your mind. And that's what brought change. So true leadership, I mean, in many ways is about implementing that change for the better, not necessarily, ruling or any of those things. It's about that change. I love what you said.
The desired effect, not the desired result. You bet.
Yeah.
Well, we know the attitude of the Israelites after they were released from Egyptian bondage. Moses led them, and to your point, we would look at that and say, by all earthly standards, he was a failure. But I think in reality, we in our minds, we tend to make leadership about a pretty fast moving resolution or result. But when you look at the full scope of what Moses did through his leadership, all through the wilderness wandering, he was continuing to be faithful to God and to lead the people toward the promised land, though they were wandering for 40 years. But at the moment when they get to the edge of the Jordan, and Moses has died now, but his effect of his leadership is continuing to play out, you have Joshua there who's ready to lead, and God calls him. And there's that covenant that's made in the beginning of that moment where the people say, hey, we're on board, and granted, this is seemingly a whole new group of people, a whole new generation of people, but at the same time, through the course of that generation dying away in the wilderness wandering, to the point of where those children of the people who said, hey, we're ready to go back to Egypt, this new generation, through the leadership of Moses and I think Joshua too, up to that point of that Jordan crossing, they finally come to this point of saying, yeah, we're committed. We're doing this. And they set their mind to that. And so I would say that as a leader, we need to also remember that it's not an overnight result that we'll see. At times it may be lengthy. It may be a few years down the road before we see the culture of a congregation or the mindset of the members within our congregations be molded or shaped to come to that desired effect.
It's hard. It has to be hard, I think, for a leader. What you just said, because you mentioned Moses, we may not see the desired effect. Yeah. We may contribute to it, but Moses isn't the one that gets to take them in. And I think as leaders, the idea of humility, I play my part, but somebody else may lead the people to that promised land, or cross the finish line of the goal that we have in mind. Sometimes it's so hard. Ego's part of it, and somehow keeping that out of the way and leading with humility and understanding, look, I'm going to play my part here, but somebody else may get to take that last few steps into the promised land. But God's working through our lives in so many wonderful ways. I'm thinking mainly, when you say leadership, because of my role as a preacher, I'm thinking about eldership. But every time I preach, I look out at a congregation full of leaders. Yeah. Mm-hmm. We have people that are leading in the school system. They are leading in business. We've got some incredible families here, some mothers who are tremendous leaders in their home, in almost every area you can think of. I think Christians ought to be great leaders, because we're following a great leader. Yeah. And I see that, when I preach, you just look around and you see all of these really capable, talented, impactful people. And I think sometimes if we're not careful, we limit our vision of what leadership means. It's those men that, we have these qualifications in Timothy and Titus, they're elders, they're deacons. I think it goes way beyond that. Yeah. There's leadership in so many levels of life. And what I love about what you're talking about, because most of my life has been spent in ministry. I'm working with life in the congregation. To have Christians that go into a boardroom, into a business deal, and they lead for Jesus in that setting. Others in a classroom, others in a locker room. I think coaches are great leaders. Mm-hmm. It's encouraging to me to see a congregation full of people who are really leading for God in wonderful ways, and not just within the context, that narrow focus of congregational life. For us to be what God wants us to be in the world, it's got to happen outside the walls of a church building. And I like your perspective is interesting to me, and I feel this way about Mark too, because it's more corporate. You've taken your faith into the workplace, and what does leadership look like there?
So I'll raise the question. What would it be like if the church had that reputation? That if you want to learn how to be a leader in your context, in your home, in your school, in your business, in your community, in the church, if you want to learn how to be a leader, you should go to the Church of Christ. They will teach you how to do that. Wouldn't that be an awesome reputation for us to have?
And maybe it's a best kept secret. Maybe there are congregations and Christians who are tremendous examples of what we're talking about, but it's, for whatever reason, it's the last place that people tend to think. I can't come up with the verse. I keep thinking men of Israel understood the times and knew what to do. As Christians, we ought to know what to do. Mm-hmm. When things aren't working in someone's marriage, when they don't know what to do with a kid that's just giving them fits, when they're struggling with their finances, whatever it is, spiritual life is practical. I think as people who believe this book comes from the mouth of God, this is the mind of God in human language. We ought to be resourceful people that when you don't know what to do, you go to those folks. They understand the times. They know what to do.
Earlier I mentioned that book written by Barry Conchie as the best-selling leadership book of all times, and that's how it's phrased when people talk about the book. But it's interesting because we all know what the best-selling leadership book of all times really is, but I have to just mention a quick story, and that is when I was a a much younger person than I am now, and I had one of my first leadership opportunities. I was sitting with my boss, and he made a comment about something we needed to do related to the team, and I basically quoted Proverbs chapter 24. And he looked at me, just spun around and looked at me. It's like, where do you come up with these things? Right? And I was, and those things just kind of come out of you. And I said, well, from the Bible, that was Proverbs chapter 24. And he looked at me. He really did, with the strangest look, and he said, I don't own one. And I actually bought him his first Bible, took it in there like the next week and said, you do now. But it's so fun. People search for so many places to find answers of how to be an effective leader, and they're just right there.
I think that's such a great point. When was it that Moses really became the leader that God wanted him to be? It's when he came down with the word of the Lord. When he dies and they go over into the promised land, they cross the Jordan, they set the 12 stones. Joshua is now the leader, but he's not the leader truly until he wrote down the word of the Lord. There is never a good godly leader that does not have the word of God with him. And I think that's such a great point that you brought up, that, quoting Proverbs and these different leadership things that we see, we see them in many ways, but apply them to what true leadership is important. And maybe that leads us into this idea that actually Tim was talking about was, I think that all of us have to recognize our gifts that you talked about and understand who God designed us to be and not try to be something else. I think there's a great amount of importance there, because there are people who insert themselves into a quote-unquote leadership role that should never be in that role. And I think that we all know, and you've alluded to, some of our greatest leaders in the church you never hear from because their actions are the greatest words. Yeah. And to understand what God designed you to be and to use those gifts for the betterment of the kingdom, for the betterment of your family, whatever that looks like. I think understanding that may be the greatest challenge that all of us face. And understand that we'll never reach that potential unless we have this with us. Yeah. So when we think about a phrase, leader in the church, or something equivalent to that, is that something that we feel only refers to elders, or does it refer to others?
Well, I think we've made it statements, several of us made the statement that it's everyone, but I think the default is that when we talk about leadership in the church, I think most people, the general thought is we're talking about elders. Yeah. I think sometimes people would include deacons or maybe ministers, but I think generally speaking, the congregation would think that when you use the term leaders or leadership, they're thinking elders. Now, again, I don't think that's the case. I think everyone is a leader. I loved what you were talking about. You're preaching to a congregation, you're looking out, and they're all leaders, whether that be in their workplace or wherever it is, even in the home, as you talked about Aubrey's statement about it, that's where it begins. But I think generally speaking that we have to do a better job of helping people see that it's not just the elders, but I think that's what people think of.
I think one of the keys of being a leader is empowering others. I mean, and I know at North Mac, there are a lot of people that come in, feel like we're approachable to come in with an idea. I'm thinking of one in particular. Young family came in right after the Roe v. Wade Supreme Court decision, and they said, with this decision, there's going to be a lot of young children that need adoption, need help fostering. We want we want to do something about that. And we're usually when somebody comes in, we're like, it's a great idea. Come back with a plan, give us a little budget. Let's talk a little more about it. But I think be able to empower, and there's, I mean, I could just, Tim may need to help me, but community lunches.
So the elders have set a tone here with something they call Dream Sunday. And Mark, I don't know if that was in place before or after you. I think almost from the beginning. Mac Layton has a book, How to Build a Great Church. A lot of things you read in that book, they're still doing here, right? And Dream Sunday is every elder in the classroom on Sunday morning saying, what are your dreams? Well, that fosters an environment where your dreams are welcome. But along with that, you're responsible for your dream. Don't bring us a good suggestion of what you think we should be doing. Take the personal leadership of your vision of what you think we should be doing, and from that you have a recovery group here for men and women on Saturday morning and Sunday night. You have a sewing ministry, which just blows my mind. We get more mail from the community, from somebody that's a cancer patient, just had open heart surgery, has an infant that's been in the hospital, and they get these things that these ladies, I say from 9 to 11, it's like a sweatshop over there. It's crazy. Sewing machines are, cut that's probably politically incorrect. But they're tutoring at a school down the road here. They've started the Shining Stars, which is we're against abortion, we're for adoption and fostering, and any number of things. The staff did not come up with that. The elders did not come up with that. It's the personal leadership of the members that have a vision and a dream and a passion. But then spiritual leadership needs to be open to saying, we trust you to make that move from the dream stage of that into a ministry. And that idea of delegation, of trusting, not just that, I love so much what those qualities in the book you mentioned. They have to trust the leaders. The leaders have to trust them. Yes. Yeah. And great leadership is not afraid to let people try.
That's that empowerment. Yes. That's the empowerment that the members are not afraid to come in. They're going to be shot down or negative, or somebody's going to just push you away. You got to be able to bring those people in and listen to them. Listen from their perspective, from where they're coming from, but don't look at the elders and expect us to do all the work. So there's a trust that goes back and forth that you have to have as leaders, and that's in the corporate world or here at the church level. But the Shining Stars was one that they had an idea that it was on their hearts. You could tell it was on their hearts. But what's the plan? Come back and. And it's our responsibility as leaders to help them with that journey, because what we in this specific instance, we said, go talk to this family. Go talk to this family. They've fostered. These two families have adopted. Go talk to them. Get their input. What do you think? And all of a sudden, we've got a large group called Shining Stars. That's one of our most wonderful ministries here. Very engaged with the children's homes, but also they're in our community and they're shining lights out there. And we've got families who are taking on fostering, temporary fostering. It's just a wonderful way, and it's a wonderful way to get people into the church and from outside to be able to look inside the church family here and get an idea of what we're all about.
Yeah. You going back to that trust, when the first few years of Excel Still More was, it was me doing, kind of trying to get this thing to grow, and it's only in my head, and I had created a logo, which I had never done in my life. I was working at a website, which I had never done in my life, and I'm trying to get this thing to go until my son calls me about 3 years into it, and he said, "Dad, that is the worst logo I've ever seen." I was offended by that. And he said, I found out, he said, your website needs some work. And then I find out, I'm talking to another buddy, his son at Freed Hardeman was in a marketing class. They were designing websites, looking at that. They were using my website for what not to do. It was really, really bad. So anyway, I was highly offended to all this, and I'm talking to my son Parker, and he's just constantly telling me, he's telling me, and man, I'm fighting against it because I want to hold to this looks good. I did this. This is mine. Until one day I had had enough, and I said, you just design a logo and show it to me. And whenever he designed it, which is what's on these cups, I thought that's so much better than what I did. And I'll tell you this, that this work did not grow until I allowed him to be a part of it.
Wow. That's
And
great.
and I think that is one of the toughest things to do.
Yeah.
When you are, and if you are in a quote unquote leadership role, you know this by what the company you've been with. You know this. You've been here. You said almost 21 years. You know you have. Be the good. That's your baby, right? And when you put so much time into something such as a congregation or a work, a business, a nonprofit, a ministry, when you put so much time into it, you think about it all the time. It is so hard to listen to what anybody else has to say. And I think if we limit ourselves to our minds, we will never grow. And we're not allowing different perspectives to come in. We're not allowing the creativeness of others to be a part of what we're doing to help build on that. And I think that goes to maybe what we'll kind of wind things down here with is does leadership exempt us from the one another passages, right? It's the love one another that we think about, humble yourselves toward one another. All of those one another passages that we probably all dealt with on a summer series or a Bible class. Does it exempt us from those things, or is that the most important thing to us whenever it comes to leadership?
Yeah, we should embody those. I mean, really, as leaders, you have to embody those. Otherwise, you're not going to be an effective leader.
Yeah.
That was an easy, quick answer.
Yeah.
I was expecting more conversation.
You're looking at something. You got something in mind?
He's got it round in the back. He's serious.
Yeah, man. Yeah, I'm up on it. I say this. Keith's heard me say this. I love Peter. I just have to say that. I'm going to say that on camera. I love Peter because I have a tendency to be a bit type A and fairly driven, and many times have put my foot in my mouth, just like Peter. But he in 1 Peter 5:5, if you answer that question, you younger men likewise be subject to your elders, and then listen to the next phrase. Here's the answer to your question. And all of you, including you elders, all of you, clothe yourselves with humility towards one another. The answer is no, it does not exempt us from that. And if we ever step out of that, that means we forgot that we're not the leader here. That we are someone sent, someone focused to work for the leader, but all of you clothe yourselves with humility. And if we ever lose that, I love Numbers 12:3 because it says Moses, who we've talked about, a failure and a success. It said he was the most humble person on the planet. That's what it says. So someone who did one of the biggest things in history for God, not the biggest, but one of the biggest responsibilities of anyone was humble like that. And then you fast forward and say, hey, all of you, when you're in a leadership position, think about, function more like Moses, don't function so much like others.
Yeah, and Peter's addressing shepherds, right? And as followers of Jesus, we're following the good shepherd. And so when you move that forward, if we're supposed to follow his example as leaders within the church, particularly elders, shepherds, it makes sense that we're among people. A shepherd is among the sheep, and you think about John 10 when Jesus talks about the true shepherd. The sheep know him, and he knows them by name, calls them.
Yeah. Just think about that statement. He knows them by name. Yeah. It's so personal.
In order to do that, you've got to be among one another.
They know his voice.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, just a thought from 1 Peter, I think it's interesting as he goes into chapter 5, he just got done talking about the fact that we should entrust ourselves to God the way that Jesus entrusted himself. And so that's the type of leadership that we need is whether you're a father, a mother, a preacher, an elder, a deacon, a CEO, whatever, trust your heart to the Lord. And you'll grow. You'll fall like Peter did. You'll stick your foot in your mouth a few times. But the thing I love about Peter is, while in many cases he was the first one out, he was always the first one in. And I always look at, and I guess you could look at it from a lot of different ways, but when they see Jesus on the shore, Peter's done. Jesus is gone in his mind. He doesn't know what to do. He's going back fishing, but whenever they're fishing, he's out. Guy doesn't even have any clothes on. They see Jesus on the shore. Everybody else rows themselves to shore. Peter jumps out. He's all in. And I think that's just so telling. So, guys, thank you so much for all this good conversation. I'm looking forward to having some more. Thank you.